Welcome to Resource PNG. For this program, we talk about carbon capture and storage. The following is a presentation from the Vice President for Operations and Engineering of an American company called Kinder & Morgan. The Vice President, Mr. Charles Fox, gave this lecture before the Society of Petroleum Engineers, PNG. His talk was called Carbon Capture and Storage, SWOT Analysis, what it will take to move forward.
Today I'd like to talk about carbon capture and storage, a SWOT analysis, and what it would take to move forward and implement this technology. What I'm going to talk about today first is some definitions about what carbon capture and storage is, and also what is a SWOT analysis. And then I'm going to talk about the opportunities, strengths, weaknesses, and threats that we have to implementing carbon capture and storage. And then finally, I'll give a conclusion and suggest a path forward for society. Well, what is carbon capture and storage? Well, one definition is it's the capture and secure storage of carbon that would otherwise be emitted or remain in the atmosphere. And that's a definition that was made by the United States Department of Energy. And it consists of three different types of technologies. First, the capture of CO2 from an industrial source. Second, where you transport it from that capture location out to an injection site. And finally, the injection of the CO2 into the ground and then monitoring it as you store it for the long term. So it consists of three different types of technologies. A SWOT analysis, SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it was a technique that was devised by a professor at Stanford by the name of Alfred Humphrey in the 1960s and 1970s to analyze Fortune 500 companies, and those are large United States companies. And it was used to do some type of strategic analysis. And I'm going to use that same technique to analyze the technology of carbon capture and storage. Now, SWOT analysis begins with an objective or an end state, and then it goes through the strengths of a company, which are the internal characteristics of a company has to prosper or achieve its objectives. The weaknesses, that's also an internal defects that companies would have to being profitable and expanding. And then there's some external agents, opportunities. These are the chances that a company has to be successful. And then the threats. Those are external agents that causes the company to have problems. Instead of using the company, I'm going to focus on the technology and whether or not we really can employ it. Now, our objective here is to implement carbon capture and storage on a large scale in order to significantly reduce CO2 emissions. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. First, let's start with the opportunities, because that's really the easiest to grasp. It could have a huge economic impact. Here we have a graph that was put together by the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they made a couple estimates. They estimated that by the year 2030, as much as 13 gigatons of CO2 could be captured, and then by 2100, that could go up to over 40 gigatons. And a gigatons is a billion tons, 1,000 million billion. And then they also made another low case estimate that's 1/10 of that amount. Now that's a huge variance. And so we would hope that the answer would be somewhere in between. Now, put that in some perspective, today the world emits about 30 billion tons a year of CO2. So this would be trying to capture about 40, in another 18 years, capturing about 43% of the world's emissions today. So it's a tall order. But if we say that through taxes or some other mechanism that the price of CO2 would be $50 a ton, this would create an industry worldwide that would be worth about $350 billion a year. And if you put that in terms of jobs, at least in the United States, it takes about $66,000 a year to create one job. There would be about, this industry could employ about 10 million people. Now, that doesn't take into account the fact that if you increase the price of energy, other activities may disappear, but a lot of these jobs would be for petroleum engineers or people that are in this room today. So that is the opportunity. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some perspective and how big an opportunity or how big a task this is. 13 billion tons per year of CO2. If you were to take CO2 and you were to compress it perhaps to 2,000 psi or 138 atmospheres, which is about the pressure you need to put it in the ground, CO2 would turn from a gas into a liquid, or the dense phase, and it would be equivalent to, if you were to inject that 13 billion tons a year of CO2 and you were to pressurize it and put it into this liquid phase, that would be equivalent to injecting 300 million barrels a day of CO2 into the ground. More perspective is that world oil production today is about 75 million barrels a day, and with it comes about 750 million barrels of oil a day, and with it comes 250 million barrels of water. So we would be handling about the same amount of fluid in injecting CO2 into the ground as the oil business handles today in oil and water. So again, it is, in order to really do this, that's a tall, tall order. But again, that is the hope here for carbon capture and storage.
When we return, we talk about the strengths of this SWOT analysis. Carbon capture and storage is not a new technique. This process has been around since the 1930s and is used primarily in the petroleum industry.
Now, what are some of the strengths? We hear a lot of different technologies that would be used, reduce CO2 emissions or the CO2 content in the atmosphere. A lot of them we don't know how to do, but this one we do. We do know how to do carbon capture and storage because we do that. We do all of the pieces every day. There's a wealth of CO2 flooding experience that has been developed where CO2 is injected in the ground, and we can use that. Back in the 1970s, it was found that some plants in West Texas, this is a picture of the United States, some plants in West Texas were emitting CO2, or they were venting CO2. What was happening was that natural gas was being produced, and it was coming out of the ground with CO2 in it. And in order to sell it into the market, companies had to strip out the CO2, and then they vented it, and then they sold the natural gas. Well, it was understood that if you were to be able to inject CO2 in the ground, and you could enhance oil production. So some companies like Shell and Chevron gathered that CO2, built a pipeline, and they started to inject it into the ground at places like Sac Rock, which is up in here, which our company, Kinder Morgan, operates today through some acquisitions. So there was the CO2 enhanced oil recovery began with taking anthropogenic or man-made CO2 and then capturing it and then putting it in the ground to enhance oil production. So that's been going on for about 40 years. After that, what happened was there wasn't enough of a big source or inexpensive source of CO2, so companies started to look not for industrial sources, but for underground sources, and they found them in, this is the state of Colorado, and in New Mexico, over here in the state of Mississippi, and then up here in the state of Wyoming, most of it in the western part of the United States. And there they found CO2 fields that were like natural gas fields. You injected it or you drilled into them and it produced nearly pure carbon dioxide. So that's what has been, that type of CO2 is what's been used for the last 40 years. There's been a little bit of this anthropogenic CO2, which would count for CCS, but mostly it's underground sources due to the cost. So we learned how to handle CO2. We learned how to transport it. And then up here, before I go to the next slide, this is a gasification plant, the North Dakota gasification plant, where they take coal, they gasify it, and as part of that industrial process, pure CO2 is made, and it was being vented. And then in the year 2000, a pipeline was put in to capture that CO2 and then take it to the Weyburn field, the Weyburn oil field in Canada. And I'll talk about that a few more times. Oh, put it in perspective here, about 50 million tons per year of CO2 is purchased for injection. That's about 1% of all of U.S. emissions. And I have to say again that most of that comes from underground and it goes back in the ground. So it's really not a carbon capture and storage. Only maybe 5% of that total is really would count for carbon capture and storage. Now, another strength is we talk about the capture technology. Some of it's very old and mature, which is both good and bad. It's good because you know how to do it, but it's kind of bad because if you've been doing it for 80 years, how much better are you going to get at it? In fact, when you look at, there's three different types of capture technologies. There's post-combustion capture, and that comes after you've burned something. You've burned coal or natural gas, and then you take that and you capture the CO2, separate out the CO2. That's post-combustion capture. There's also pre-combustion capture. That's sort of the gasification technologies where you create hydrogen and CO2 as part of a chemical process. And that's called pre-combustion because CO2 is made before you combust the hydrogen in this case. And then there's also oxy-fueled, and that's where you separate out oxygen before you combust the hydrocarbon. And you do that because then you get a nearly pure stream of CO2. The first patent for acid gas removal was given in 1930, and here's just a picture of an amine contactor that's used to separate out CO2 and hydrogen sulfide from natural gas or from some types of gases. And this technology is patented in 1930. It's used all over the world. And when we talk about post-combustion capture, what we talk about is using some type of amine or a chilled ammonia or something like that that absorbs the CO2 and then it regenerates. It's just a simple chemical absorption model. There's also the coal gasification, which I talked about. This is pre-combustion capture. That technology actually goes back to the 1780s. Now, it was vastly improved in the 20th century, but again, these technologies are quite old. Oxy-fuel is new, and the reason it isn't being used very much is because when you combine pure oxygen with a hydrocarbon, the flame temperature is so high that it causes metals to deform. And so the turbine manufacturers, people at GE or Siemens and those types of people, they're working in research to get their turbines and things like that to work.
So the technology has been around for a while. What about infrastructure? We shall hear about that after the break. With the threat of global warming, there is a push by most countries to cut down on the amount of carbon dioxide they produce. Carbon dioxide is a colorless gas that is produced when fuels like diesel or coal is burned. In this part of Mr. Fox's lecture, he talks about some weaknesses of carbon capture and storage.
A strength that CCS has is it helps save infrastructure that society has invested into various technologies, really usually coal. A lot of what we talk about in CCS is really focused on capturing CO2 from coal plants, electrical generation plants that use coal to burn. In 2008, the U.S. Energy Information Agency added up all the coal-fired power plants in the United States and found that there was 1,445 of them, spread out all over the United States, with a capacity of 315,000 megawatts. Now, recent costs are it costs about $3 million per megawatt to build a power plant. And that means there's $1 trillion invested in power plants in the United States, and India and Russia and China and Europe, people all over the world have a lot of investment in their coal-fired plants, and they really don't want to scrap them and start all over again. And so CCS is thought to be a way that we could preserve this investment. And the investment isn't just in the power plants. There's also investments in coal mines. There's investments in railroads. There's investments in universities that teach people how to use all this. So it would be nice to be able to use a coal or keep using coal if we can. And a strength here is that, well, one thing I want to do before I leave the strengths is to make sure you understand that if you combine CCS with oil production or enhanced oil recovery, it actually does have a net benefit for carbon in the atmosphere. Because the thought is that, well, wait a minute, you are taking the CO2 and putting it in the ground, that's very good, but when someone walks out and sees all the equipment that you use and all the compression, and then you have all the pumps in the wells, and you're spinning fluids out of the ground and you're putting them back in the ground, aren't you somewhere else, aren't you burning so much power from the power plant, whether it's a natural gas plant or a coal plant, aren't you putting more CO2 in the atmosphere than you're putting in the ground? And saying, no, that's not true. My company did a very detailed study of what our direct and indirect emissions were at our Sac Rock field in West Texas. And we did this, we took into account, we have a power plant, how much the power plant emitted, how much the power that we bought emitted. We went all the way down to lawnmowers and forklifts. So there was really nothing we could think of that we left out. And we found that we were emitting about 0.1 tons of CO2 for every barrel of oil that we produced. And we can forecast that enhanced oil recovery at Sac Rock will be 185 million barrels, and that we're going to purchase 260 million tons of CO2. So that means our emissions are going to be 18.5, that's 0.1 times 185. So the total sequestered is about 242 million tons. That's about 92% of the CO2 net remains in the ground. There's also some people that say, well, wait a minute, you're going to take that, you're going to produce oil, and now you're going to burn the oil. So now let's take that into account. And I disagree with that right now because CO2 enhanced oil recovery is so small. So if you do CO2 EOR, you're displacing oil that would be made some other way. Just assuming you're going to produce the oil no matter what. I think the critics would be right if this was the only way to produce oil. But I think that's wrong today. But if you include if you say, well, I'm going to burn all the oil, I'm not going to make plastics, but I'm going to burn the oil, that number, 92%, drops to 48%. So no matter what, if you combine carbon capture and storage with enhanced oil recovery, you are, on a net basis, reducing the amount of CO2 that's going up in the atmosphere. Now the weaknesses. This is going to get into why aren't we doing it today, because really, if you come to West Texas, I live in Houston, but my oil fields are in West Texas. we don't have enough CO2. So you think, well, why aren't we doing this today if you want to do enhanced oil recovery? Why aren't you just going out and capturing it and putting it in the ground? Well, there's a lot of weaknesses, and the biggest one is unfavorable economics, but I'll go through this. Unfavorable economics and public acceptance are the biggest problem that this technology has. Let's talk about all of these. Okay, the weakness. This is maybe, I don't know, this one or public acceptance are the biggest one. This is a plot that shows the abatement cost. The abatement cost is the cost to reduce CO2 emissions in terms of, this is in euros per ton, and it goes from 80 positive, this is a cost, to negative 80, which is actually a benefit to an economic benefit to society. And then here's all the various types of technologies and how important each one of them is. And then I've highlighted in red what's involved with CCS. So what you see here is that there's a lot of opportunities that society has to reduce CO2 emissions that actually pay for themselves. And these are things like efficiencies and conservation. So things like that, if cars would just get more miles or kilometers per gallon or liter, well then that would make money. Some of these have to do with if we would just make flat screen TVs more efficiently. There's a couple ways to make flat screen TVs. They both cost the same amount of money. And one of them, these flat screen TVs, barely uses any power, and the other ones uses a lot. Well, society and the investment turns over every couple of years. So society could just say, would make money if we decided just to make more efficient flat screen TVs. So that's what's out here on the left. If you go out here on the right, these are things that cost money, and you see that carbon capture and storage become some of the most expensive options to reducing CO2 emissions, even if you combine it with EOR. And this shows if you build a coal plant, a new coal plant that was designed to capture EOR, instead of saying a coal plant that's to retrofit it, and you combine it with EOR, even then it's negative. And that's because it costs so much to capture the CO2 that you just can't sell it to an oil field for a profit. I'll just point one other thing here is I think this is the nuclear option and forestry, which costs a little bit of money. It comes in here, but people like forests. So that's something that would cost society money to build more forests, but it's something most people like.
We will talk about the weaknesses of setting up a carbon capture and storage system after the break. The idea of carbon capture and storage seems beneficial in theory, but there are some weaknesses that need to be considered. Mr. Charles Fox.
Well, let me talk a little bit more about the costs and why CO2 capture and CO2 enhanced oil recovery don't work together. What I have here is the cost of CO2 avoided and the cost of CO2 captured for 3 different types of technologies, and this is in dollars. This is in U.S. dollars per ton, and it's for a natural gas combined cycle plant. It's for a standard pulverized coal electric plant. These are all electric plants, and a gasification plant. That's an integrated gasification combined cycle plant, and it's for 3 different technologies. And I've shown the uncertainties. There's huge uncertainties on this because all these costs are people doing it on a piece of paper or in their computer programs. People really haven't built these plants, so it's hard to know what they cost. And the difference between an avoided cost and a captured cost is the reason that you would use an avoided cost is if if CO2 has no benefits, then society has to pay, say, $91 a ton to sequester the CO2. But if you can sell the CO2, the plant could sell it for $67 and make a profit. Well, what's the difference? The difference is that if you put in a capture facility, you lose about 25% of your power output. So if it's pollution that you are concerned with, it doesn't make sense to reduce the size of your plant. So if you have a 100 megawatt plant to start with, you have to build it larger in order to have 100 megawatts for society to use electricity. But if CO2 is really an industrial product, then it's worth using electricity to make it. So that's the difference, and if you have more questions, you may have to think about that. But in any case, these costs of capture are what's important when you want to sell it. I've shown that they're all higher than this target price. And what this target price is, and this is all, I put it in 2007, it is about 58% of the oil price. So what that means is that if oil prices are $100 a barrel, oil field can only pay about $58 a ton for the CO2. And I based that on my experience in operating CO2 floods. My company has the sales prices. We've been selling CO2, our predecessor's company has been selling CO2 into the market since 1983, and we can see what the market will bear for CO2. And really, other than the oil price, the CO2 price is the biggest determinant of whether or not you make a profit. And so you can only spend so much money on the CO2 or you don't make a profit, and this is a pretty good number. And that's why you rarely ever see a plant being built and then capturing the CO2. I will say, though, that the gasification plant in North Dakota is selling the CO2. Well, why would it do that? Well, it was built with government money. So once it was built during the 1970s and started operating in 1884. It was part of the energy crisis of the 1970s. The United States government gave money to put the plant in, and once it was in, it just kept operating. But if it didn't have a subsidy, it would never have been built. So that's why, if you get it built, you can capture it. And that's one thing you find. If there's a nearly pure source of CO2, then you can capture that source, and you can, at a profit, and sell it to an oil field. And that's done at fertilizer plants because it has a nearly pure source of CO2. So that's the economics of it. A weakness is, I talked a little bit about it in the previous slide, you need more coal mines. If you want to capture the CO2, you have to use part of the output of the plant to capture it. In fact, there's about 25% losses due to capturing CO2. So that means you have to build your plant 25% bigger to keep the lights on in the cities, and you'll need 25% more coal in order to have the same electric output. And that could be a wonderful thing if you're a coal miner, but it's certainly something that society has to deal with. Another weakness is that you might not think about is that there's a divided ownership of assets and the expertise. You have to know how to capture, how to transport, and store it. If you go to an electric utility, they know how to burn coal or natural gas or whatever it is and make power. Now you're asking them to capture it. And that's really normally is a chemical process. So now they have to, and that's usually something that's done by an oil company or a chemical company. I think that the coal companies or the electric utilities will decide to learn how to use this because it's right next to their plant. And it's just integral with it. So they'll want to do that. But then the next step is that they need to transport that CO2 someplace to put it in the ground. Now, if it's only a kilometer away, well, anybody can put that into a pipe, and what could go wrong? Well, you say what could go wrong, but over a kilometer, not very much, and you can monitor it, and it's not very expensive. But if you decide you're going to have to take it across a continent or a long way, a utility might want to get a pipeline company involved. And then finally, that electric utility, it has no expertise at all in injecting something into the ground and monitoring it. And one of the things that you find is that oil companies know how to do all this. We know how to inject substances into the subsurface and monitor it. We know how to pipeline things, and we operate chemical facilities. So oil companies know how to do it, but they don't always put all this expertise in one place. They may have a pipeline company and a chemical or refining company and then a production company. So Kinder Morgan is unusual because we focused on EOR, so the pipelining and the oil fields all work for me, but that's very unusual. So anyway, it's just harder to get things done. That's not a big problem. Another thing is it requires a lot of land. What I've shown here is if you have a typical plant, which is a 600 megawatt plant, and you run that for 40 years, and you want to capture the CO2 and put it in the ground, it might take 100 square miles, which is 26,000 hectares, and 100 square miles would be 160 kilometers by 160 kilometers. And I put that box up there over the city of Houston, and imagine how many million people would live on top of where you're injecting the CO2. So usually the plants are near the cities. But that means that, yes, you will have to pipe, which is good for my company. We're mostly a pipeline company. We would love to transport anyone's CO2, but then you have to take it out into a rural area where there's fewer people, but no matter where you go, there are people. So there's a lot of people that can be afraid of CO2. They can object to it. And then you have to deal with a lot of people.
When we come back, Mr. Fox will talk about the results of a survey of what people thought about carbon capture and storage. Do stay with us. What do people really think about the process of carbon capture and storage? There have been a number of opinions about this topic from developed nations. In this part of Mr. Charles Fox's presentation, he gives some examples of where this technique has been used.
And then another one is the public acceptance is unknown, and I'm being charitable. There was a few studies that was done a few years ago, and they asked people on what their opinion on carbon capture and storage was. And they were in the United States, in Canada, Sweden, United Kingdom, and Japan. And what they found out was people had not do not have much of an opinion on carbon capture and storage. It was interesting that they asked people in Japan. It was in Tokyo and Sapporo, and Sapporo is on the northern island, and it's somewhat rural, farmland, that sort of thing. And they asked them what they thought, and they were generally favorable to it. And then they asked them follow-up questions. And they asked them, well, would you support injecting CO2 into the ocean, just into the ocean to dissolve? And they didn't support that. So not very many people support that. He says, well, what would if you injected it into the ground below the ocean? And they said, no, they didn't want to do that. And then they asked them, well, what about injecting it into the land, in the ground under the land? And they didn't want to do that. So the only place to put it is in the atmosphere. So, but in general, the more people everywhere but in the United States, the more people knew about carbon capture and storage, the more they supported it. But in the United States, the more people knew about it, the more they didn't want to do it. So that's a problem there. What I have up here is a graph of what the Canadians thought. And I think this is from about 2008. And what types of technologies they would use or they would not use for carbon mitigation. And almost everybody wanted to use efficiency. I don't know why you would say you didn't want to use efficiency, but I don't know. But anyway, efficiency, they liked solar and wind, they liked hydropower. People say they like hydropower, but then they don't like dams, so I don't know. So hydropower, biomass and sinks, then CCS, and just more than half of the people in Canada would use this technology. Then came nuclear, and then finally iron fertilization, which is it's when you put iron out onto the ocean and it causes algae to bloom. So they've tried that, but it doesn't seem like anybody wants to do that. This was pretty much the same everywhere except in the United States, where in the United States people, they preferred nuclear to CCS, but that was before the disaster in Japan, and I'm not sure that would be the case anymore. So in Canada, at least, more than half of the people said they would do it, but it was the least preferred of anything more than half agreed with. So another weakness is it's unproven on a large scale with a power plant. Okay? Now there's several large-scale projects here. There's Statoil as injecting CO2 at their Schleitner field in the North Sea and their Snøhvit field in the Barents Sea. They're injecting about 1 million tons a year into the subsurface below the North Sea, and they're monitoring it. They do seismic, so they know where it is. Insala is in Algeria. That's Sonatrach. BP and Statoil is there too, and they're injecting about 700,000 tons a year into the ground. There's Weyburn in Canada. That is 1.5 million tons a year. But what you see here, they're pretty much they're all oil company activities where they're injecting them into oil fields or gas fields. And they're not injecting it into these saline reservoirs, which we don't know too much about right now. You know, you'll soon end up, if you do the numbers, there's a lot of oil fields to inject CO2 into, but there's a lot more CO2 in the world than there was oil fields. And so you'll soon fill those up. So at some point you have to inject it just into the ground. So nobody's really doing that. Here's some, fertilizer plants, that sort of thing. So only Schleitner and Weyburn have more than 10 years of history, and there's not any power plants involved in this. Now, in West Texas, there actually will be building, they got funding for it, they will be building a power plant there, and Kinder Morgan will be transporting their CO2. But that got government money also. So let's talk about some threats, and I've listed them here, and I'm going to go over conservation, other power sources, and the NGOs, and failure. Now, a threat is conservation. Now, it's really hard to be against conserving, but this is a SWOT analysis, so we have to say, well, what would prevent us from doing CCS? And society really should decide to conserve, which is cheap, and actually it makes you money. If you do it right, you actually will get a return on your investment. So society should invest in conservation before it invests in CCS. So this is a threat, but there's no way to conserve. No matter what, you have to produce power, even if you're conserving it. So the other thing is you could go with nuclear or renewables. These types of technologies don't emit any CO2. So if you, at least on site, so if you have a nuclear power plant, there's no CO2 emissions. Or if you have a wind farm or a solar plant, there's no emissions on site. Another thing you can do is called fuel switching. You could switch to natural gas. And if you burn coal, 13% of the gas in the flue stack is CO2. If you burn natural gas, it's only 3%. So that's why when you talk about CCS, a couple things. You usually don't talk about gathering the CO2 from a natural gas-fired plant because you have so little CO2 in the stack. It's only 3%, and you have to handle a lot of gas with just a little bit of CO2. So usually it's focused on coal plants. But when you run the numbers, a coal plant emits 800 kilograms per megawatt hour. That's 0.8 tons per megawatt hour. And natural gas is only 370. So if you switch to burning natural gas, half your emissions go away. So that's another thing that society could decide to do, and especially in the United States that's found a lot of shale gas. In fact, coal plants are being shut down because the price of natural gas is so low. It's not due to global warming, it's just due to economics. So that's something society could do.
You're watching Resource PNG. When we come back, we listen to the final part of this lecture on carbon capture and storage. Thank you for staying with us. The idea of carbon capture and storage has been termed as an unproven, risky, and an expensive exercise, but it is doable, according to the Kinder and Morgan Company. Here is Mr. Fox with the final part of his lecture.
Another threat are non-governmental organizations that they could go to the court or they could cause society not to want to do this. And I'm going to read some quotes from 4 different NGOs. One is the National Resources Defense Council, which is a U.S. environmental group, and they say that CCS is a piece of the puzzle and an important tool. And this, I've talked with these people, and what they see is that there's no way that coal is going to go away. And so they want to have a way to take the CO2 that would be emitted and get it in the ground. Bologna, which is an international environmental NGO in Norway, says it's an important tool. Again, these people say that society will have electricity, it will have power, and you will burn coal because it's there, so let's find a way to make it green. Then the Sierra Club, which is a U.S. conservation group, they're skeptical. They call it immature and unreliable. And finally, Greenpeace, they say it's unproven, risky, and expensive. And so all it takes is even if a lot of people want to do it, it just takes a few people to say don't, and they can really make a lot of people worried. So that is a problem. Another threat is the failure of a demonstration project, because there hasn't been very many of these. If one of them fails, people will just point and say, well, we tried it once and it didn't work, so let's stop. There is a controversy at Weyburn, and basically it is a husband and a wife who have some land that's on top of the field, and they're saying that CO2 is being emitted. And they have found this company, Petrifying Geochem, and this is from the Winnipeg Free Press up in Canada, in Saskatchewan. Petrifying Geochem found carbon dioxide concentrations in the soil several times those typically found in field soils. So that sounds bad. And then they have this gentleman, Steve Whitaker of the Saskatchewan Petroleum Technology Research Center, says they've speculated and made leaps of logic that are very hard to support. So again, now someone's made a claim, and now you have to disprove it. I will say that the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology sent people out to the Sack Rock field to look for leakage. We were not very happy about this because nothing good could come of it. We were afraid, but actually it turned out well, because they didn't find any evidence that CO2 was being lost out of the oil field, at least to the surface. And they looked at things like the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere just right above the ground. And it was so sensitive you could see the difference between the spring and the fall, because leaves decompose and there's more CO2 goes in the atmosphere, and in the spring the plants pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's very sensitive, and they couldn't see any difference at Sac Rock or areas around it. They looked at the pH, and they didn't see any change there. And they looked at ions, like bicarbonate ions, because if CO2 comes up, it will change the chemistry of the water. And they didn't see any issues there either. So we were very happy, because I don't know what we would have done if they'd found something. I don't know. So what are some conclusions here? Well, first, it is technically feasible to reduce the emissions. We absolutely know how to do this. I believe that because I've been using CO2 for the last 20 years, and I know you can put it in the ground and it won't come out. I think there's a lot to learn if we put it into a reservoir that's not an oil and gas field. But again, this CO2 is not, I just don't believe it's going to come out of the ground. It's a way to preserve and create jobs if you've made an investment in coal mines and burning coal. It leverages an installed base, so you don't have to replace all of your power plants. It means you can have a diversity of power supply. And that's nice to have in case something goes wrong with one of them. But the problem is it's expensive and it requires significant public approval. So how do you go forward? Well, I think number one, you have to radically reduce the capture costs. If you don't do that, then society will decide, first they'll decide to do something that's less expensive, or they just might give up. You know, if something's too hard, then they might not do anything. I think we need to build some large capture facilities at power plants. We need to show that this works and how much it does cost. We have to convince the public that the storage is safe, and that's kind of a hard thing to do, because you have to convince the public the storage is safe in order to have your first big project. So that's an issue. We're going to have to inject large volumes of CO2 in the reservoir, again, to prove that it's safe to a lot of people. I think we need to start with EOR. The reason for that is that at least you get a revenue source to offset some of the costs. And that's what's happening in West Texas, where they are building a gasification plant. And so I think we start with EOR. In fact, I don't know what I did. I'll just talk loud. Now it's not called CCS. Since I put this all together, and now it's called CCUS, Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage, because after the economic disaster of the last few years, I think people realized that societies were not just going to pay for everything all at once, and they thought, well, let's just get something started and use it in oil fields and then expand from there. Job one really is to convince people to pay for it, that it's safe, and convince people to pay for it. And I'll leave you with a thought here that not everyone is afraid of CO2. Some people will take their family there and have a good time on top of a CO2 flood. And that's my family. I guess it's, wow, 9 years ago. 9 years ago. It's wonderful.
That's it for another week with Resource PNG. Thank you for your company. You can catch this presentation again online at our Resource PNG page at www.mtv.com.pg. And if you have suggestions or want more information, please email us. Until next time, have a pleasant week.